Welcome back to Pentester Diaries. In this episode, Cobalt's Grahame Turner interviews core pentester Stefan Nicula on customer communications, exploring the importance of transparency, alignment, and empathy. Let's take a look.
Welcome back to Pentester Diaries. My name is Grahame Turner, and I am your host for this episode. And today I am talking with Stefan Nicula about customer communications. Thanks for hopping on the show, Stefan.
Yeah. Hi, Grahame. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure. So before we get started, let's talk a little bit about you and who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So a couple of details about me. I'm a pen tester. I've been working on pen testing for the past 7 years. I've been doing actively and professionally this for more than 8 years. And in the past 3 years, I've actually been studying more into exploit development, reverse engineering, and Windows internals. And in terms of pen testing, I'm doing all the stack, starting from web to mobile networking and rating engagements.
That's awesome. And along the way, you are also dealing with customers from time to time.
Yes, of course. I mean, yeah, that's a big part actually of this job. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about how to communicate with customers, how to make sure that your pen test is set up for success from the start, that kind of stuff. Just kind of getting everybody on the same page at the start. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what's kind of how do you kind of set the stage for a customer? Kind of how do you walk them through what to expect when they are starting off?
Definitely. So I think the first step would be me actually preparing ahead of the client communication. So supposedly that we are speaking up from the kind of after the initial steps, of deciding the pen test and actually going through the documentation and preparing ahead of the project basically. And I think one of the quite important initial steps would be actually preparing a kickoff call. And some customers are available, some not, but usually this is a strong start, especially in a complex project, because after I prepare myself by going through the brief, to the documentation, testing the credentials, the scope, the access, it's also important to have that first kickoff, just so you can basically everyone gets together and talks about the scope.
Okay, so what does the sort of anatomy of a kickoff call look like? Where do you start? What do you try to make sure you hit?
I think one of the most important aspects in terms of a kickoff call would actually be seeing the application from the customer's eyes, like seeing their perspective on the application, while also answering all of the ad hoc questions, because let's face it, we cannot answer every question during the kickoff call. Most of the questions, actually the technical ones, are asked during the pen test, because that's when we also uncover functionalities, we uncover many aspects of the technical parts. But I think the first thing would be just getting familiar with the application and seeing the application through the customer's side, while also a quick walkthrough always helps, because you can ask quick questions regarding functionalities, and you can also quickly spot the crown jewels, or understand the business logic behind everything. Yeah.
Okay, so it kind of helps to it's you're seeing what they're expecting the application to do, so you can find ways to make it do what it's not supposed to do.
Of course, yeah, and also when it comes to customers that are not really familiarized with the pen test project, with the pen test, with the usual workflow, it's also important to just sit together and just quickly walk through what tests will be done. Maybe address any concerns that they might have. Any out of scope tests or targets. It's also a good way to familiarize the client, the customer, with the usual workflow.
Okay. So when you're kind of working through, you're talking to the customer. At what point do you start talking to the other people on your testing team and kind of getting them in? Do you meet them before the kickoff? Do you meet them after?
Yeah, so usually, on a, for example, on a Cobalt project, the team already meets up ahead and, has a couple of days to sync and really discuss, if everything is unclear or what questions we want to highlight or what we want to address mostly, on the kickoff call. And yeah, I think I think in communication, at least from the communication perspective, the earliest that we can start, the better, because we can just get everyone on the schedule, get everyone familiarized with everything, so that we are on the same page, basically. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Do you find that there's a lot of stuff that you want to kind of talk about with your team before you bring it to the customer, or stuff do you kind of prefer to talk about everything with the customer present? Is there any sort of a wall between those two communications lines?
Personally, I'm a fan of transparency and being as much as publicly as possible. So if there is a direct communication channel, like for example a Teams channel or a Slack channel, like the Cobalt is using, I think this is one of the best ways to keep a close communication with the client and also with the team. Because if you create a channel with everyone there, and if you address all the concerns and questions there, everyone gets to see what's going on with the project, and everyone gets to pitch in with their ideas or can contribute with something. Like for example, if we have some issues during the testing time, or maybe the client had some late endpoints or some late targets that they would like to cover, I think it's important to have this kind of direct communication with them. And yeah, I usually prefer to keep it publicly to because the thing is that if you start collaborating with the team more internally rather than publicly also with the client in the channel, let's say, the customer might be intended to think that there's not a lot of activity going in the background. But it's also important the client to see what questions we might have or what technical concerns we might have, because they can also pitch in with their ideas. They can start replying or responding on different matters. Yeah.
Oh, that's a very good point. Like, if you're talking somewhere they can't see, they may not realize that you're actually, doing the work. So we've talked a little bit. Is there anything else that you think we should be thinking about from the customer's perspective when it comes to communication that we haven't talked about yet?
I think, having at least from the customer's perspective, having a dedicated person would be ideal. I mean, in a project, if you have not a technical person, but rather a dedicated person to handle the communication, because not all the companies are the same, and not everyone maybe can join some integrations with direct communication channels. Maybe you're discussing via email or phone, and having someone that knows internally their application and also maybe knows internally teams that the person can quickly reach out to if there are any issues or any specific questions. But also, everyone can work. That would be ideal. That would be the ideal scenario. But everyone can also work outside that with the least amount of communication.
Right. So it's important to have somebody. If they're technical, is that a bonus, or is the technical a little bit? Does it sometimes get in the way?
Yeah, I mean, if it's technical, yeah, then that's perfect, because you get to ask the specific questions, and you have no boundaries, between explaining certain
Right.
questions or getting certain information. But it doesn't have to be,
Okay.
I think it's enough to just know the right people to forward the questions to, or involve other people into the communication. Then, yeah, it would be more than enough, I think. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Definitely having one person at least,
Yeah.
What kinds of aspects, we've talked a little bit about like the customer's perspective. What about from your perspective as a tester and from the perspective of other testers? Like what kind of things are important to set up for communication?
Yeah, so as I said, I think the direct communication channel really helps us. I've seen that an increase in the like some sort of team updates methods of reporting, or keeping in touch with the clients lately. Back a few years ago, there wasn't quite that, direct communication with the client, or at least from the pen test perspective. You get a report, let's say, at the end of the day, or at the end of the project in the engagement, and that was, kind of it. Of course, there were some communications during that phase, but you couldn't express what you've tested before or what you've accomplished so far. So I think right now, with the trend of providing updates, direct updates and constant updates to the customer, it's also good for us pen testers to index everything that we've done so far. It helps us, communicate with each other better, and overall, it results in a better coverage. Because if I see, some notes from a fellow colleague, that has tested an endpoint, let's say, and has found some interesting scenarios, but couldn't quite manage to, get it done or get to the final stages, I can pitch in and maybe help on that, or, that would be also from my side, if I have troubles identifying something, I can just, shout out, and it overall increases the team play, let's say. And yeah, I think from the pen tester's point of view, addressing questions quickly or issues, or immediately, addressing critical findings, let's say, it's really useful for us because it makes everything much smoother and much better for everyone.
Okay. Are there any tools that you like to use for that sort of thing? We've talked a little bit about Slack. Do you have any other things that you like to do to kind of make sure the communication is going through?
Yeah, so I think Slack would be one of my favorites. There's also Teams and other tools, but yeah, I mostly prefer Slack. I think this is a personal choice, but at the end of the day, any direct communication tool would help. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just mostly about putting something into the channel, because that was something that we talked a little bit about. There's no stupid questions, and we talked about making sure that we communicate. Trying to figure out exactly how to phrase this question. So we want to be able. Nobody likes looking silly, right? Nobody likes asking a question that they think other people are going to think is silly. So do you have any advice on kind of making sure that people either feel comfortable asking those questions, or a way to sort of, I don't know, and know when a question should be asked?
Okay, so I think this strongly translates into speaking your mind, rather than forging the perfect question, let's say. So if you have a question, most likely you haven't understood something fully, or you have something that's not ticking right. So I think just explaining what your understanding about the issue was and what's your question, at least in technical aspects, that would be really useful for the ones that answer, for example, the customers, and also from our side, the pen testers. It would help us understand how the question or where the question originated from, because as you said, no stupid questions. So I think overall we should do better in terms of how we explain our questions and how we got to that question in the first place.
I think that's a very good point. Yeah. So have you had any situations where either good communication and asking those questions ahead of time really helped kind of find something more interesting, or the flip side, like we were just talking about, a situation where not asking that question sooner may have created a situation? I've kind of given you two scenarios, so feel free to tackle either.
So first of all, I think regarding good communication part, to be honest, I think some of the findings or critical findings, or maybe even deep coverage tests, most of them are done. Not most of them, but some of them are done using direct client communication and strong teamwork between the pen testers and the client. Because, for example, I've had a lot of projects past projects involving complex applications with a lot of setup to be made, a lot of verification steps that you could not go through if the client would not help you through the process, through the steps. And reaching to that point, that deep coverage point, I think is really important, because let's say you're just trying your way in, or you're not familiar with the processes, or it might take quite a while. Those sometimes are never reached, in terms of a black book pen test, or let's say bug bounty process. You don't have the client that can guide you or help you validate some steps in order to move forward, in order to make the proper validations, so you can reach further into the application. And I think this also includes not asking questions fast enough, because if you have a question, if you have a concern, or if you are stuck in a specific process, I think the quickest and the fastest way to resolve this would be to ask the client about it. Of course, try to figure out first why this is not working, or what specifically do you need, because that will also speed up the process. The question should be as clear as possible, so that the client can also answer as fast as possible. Yeah.
Okay. Can you talk through any examples of a situation where communication kind of helped you get the customer and your team to the same place, or to understand the impact better? Not naming any names, obviously.
Yeah, so as I said, complex applications, like for example, past project was testing a CI/CD kind of solution, and those solutions usually involve a lot of setup. Usually involve a lot of configuration on both, the application that you're testing, but also, on your local setup that needs to contact directly the application, let's say. And I think the most important part actually in that process was communicating with the client and syncing regularly in order to make the proper setup, so we can actually reach out to the functionality that were in target, that were in scope. And also providing constant team updates, let's say, helped us reach out to the client more in terms of visibility. And the customer also understood what we were testing and how much we should change our tactic or our testing scenarios, so we can get the coverage needed for that specific project. I think that was actually a good example. Another example would be trying to identify a blind vulnerability that you cannot get a feedback from. So sometimes, for example, in some specific vulnerabilities, you can exploit them, but you cannot see the actual result of that. And also some projects were very successful from that point of view, because the customer was right on point with feedback, with output, and showing us the actions that we took, how they reflected in the backend in their internal systems. And yeah, we basically managed to confirm some of those vulnerabilities, which were rather not very accessible from the user's perspective, let's say. Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about some different scenarios that folks might find themselves in while they're pen testing. So we've talked a lot about kind of the best case scenario is when everybody's in the channel, everybody's talking, the customer's responding, the pen tester's responding. What do we do when we've got a customer that's just completely absent? They're just no response. It's you're asking questions and getting no answers.
Yeah, so that also can come in place, and I think it was more common in the beginning, when the kind of the communication with the client started going off. But now we see this more, we see this less and less. In those situations, I think first of all we kind of need to understand that not everyone has the resources to allocate, to be in contact with the project, especially when you don't have the direct communication integrations. Like for example, your internal company does not allow Slack or Teams or any other tools of that such. And in that case, the communication can be quite limited, or maybe one person installs that and has limited access over the working days for that. So I think we need to be, first of all, understandful that not everyone can allocate that resource in that time. But from a pen tester's perspective, we should also not comply on that, but actually, ask the questions that we need to ask, not really spam them, but just ask the questions. And if you get the answer, and that's ideal. If not, just leave them, as maybe address them later on, or make the client aware that there were some questions, at the start, at the end of the project, there were some questions, there were some concerns that needed maybe to be addressed in a later project, let's say.
Okay. Do you find that like sometimes there's sort of a flow of communications where sort of like, people respond when they can versus, people being around every day? Do you find it more common that people are like, I'm around at this hour and that, or are people kind of hanging out all the time and answering Slack questions?
I think not everyone, can allocate a lot of time for this, especially in the pentester side. I think there's more flexibility to it because, everyone works at different hours and, everyone could work like any time of the day, especially now that, for example, a lot of teams, pentesting teams are international, you would always find someone in the Slack channel, at least from the pentester's perspective, that can answer any questions or, address any of that stuff. From the customer side, I've seen that most of the customers are active during their business hours, their usual business hours, because they're also doing this from the business perspective, rather than, projects like pen testing. Yeah.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about, customers that aren't getting back to us. What about when we have customers who are getting back to us, but are not being very helpful, or potentially, trying to, ask more than they should be getting, that kind of stuff. The people who are being, I hesitate to say difficult, but they're being difficult.
Yeah, certainly. There are some, we encounter some of the time, difficult situations. But honestly, I think it's more from the communications perspective, because if there are some difficulties in the communication between the pen testers, and the clients, usually something was not fully understood or something was not fully, explained. Even like, for example, simple stuff like the scope, or maybe a vulnerability wasn't fully explained or better explained. We need to kind of remember that not everyone has the same background, and not everyone has the same technical background, technical details. So we kind of need to be, it's our responsibility to be as specific as possible, as detailed as possible, so everyone can understand what's going on, or, you can easily refer to the details so you can understand, if you have certain questions. And I think it's also important to kind of address everything with a positive attitude, because, at the end of the day, this is what really matters.
Cool. But did you have anything to add on that one?
Just to add, like, for example, in terms of communicating with the customer, in terms of expectations, and aligning them with the reality. For example, in some particular cases, clients might be intended to think that maybe just one pentest project per month, let's say, not per month, sorry, but per application would suffice or would cover everything that they needed, And oftentimes, some customers are surprised that, findings keep piling up even after, the second project or so. Usually, it's good to communicate this early on, and to align the expectations with the actual reality. And by that, I mean, if someone were to find all the vulnerabilities one time, especially, for example, in complex applications, complex solutions, no one would say no, but this is the actual process, and it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of tries. That's why it's also, important to have pen testing in regression tests, or, in new functionalities, just to cover everything up and, go as deep as possible.
This is maybe a question that you'd ask during the kickoff call, but it just popped into my head. Like, how important is it for you as the testers to know kind of why, the customer is asking you to test something, like whether it's compliance driven versus like we're putting this new application out and we want to know if it's broken, that kind of stuff. Like, is that super helpful or is it less useful?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is also pretty important, and yeah, it's a good question because it also helps us understand the application, how mature it is in terms of security, and it also helps us better understand the scope, the expectations, and also it guides us on our scenarios of attack. Like for example, if I would know that a functionality or an application was tested like n times before, I would not be as concerned as much about the low-hanging fruits, let's say, or vulnerability that can be easily found, rather than I would start from the start just creating more complex scenarios of attacks, targeting the business logic behind, and overall trying to find other ways, rather than the common vulnerabilities, so to speak, because most likely those have already been found in previous tests, And it's also, counterexample would be the opposite. Like for example, if an application wasn't tested before, I would be more focused on those ones initially, just so I can, get the low-hanging fruits and everything that can be found really easily, and then we can work our way up to more complex tests.
Okay. The difficult question, the one that I always have a hard time with when I'm talking to a customer, is like, when do I know whether I should say no to something? And the follow-up question is how? What's the best way to say no in a way that they're not going to become difficult?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because I think the kind of the partial question would be explaining what is possible and what not, because if the coverage is huge enough, you can do as best as possible to get that coverage while also explaining the process, But ultimately, from the process that you're doing, from the workflow and from your transparency, you can draw the conclusions that, there was not enough time, let's say, to get some coverage, or maybe there are impossible tasks like, finding vulnerabilities when they're not there, that would also, help explaining that, okay, some implementations, are okay, and not all the functionalities have some flaw in them,
Yeah, definitely. I find that very helpful when I am trying to say no to somebody, is like having something concrete to tie it to. Because I don't know, it's harder to argue against something like we didn't have enough time or it just doesn't exist versus like I don't want to.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also, I think it's also a good example where, in one project you find something, whereas in another you find a different thing, I think it's important to understand that each, pen tester, each researcher has its own test scenarios and its own perspective, and someone might find something while the other might not, And it's also, I think it falls down into one of those tricky questions, like, why hasn't this vulnerability popped up during your test, or something like that. I think the answer is more, it's more complex than that, because maybe the target was different, maybe the scope was different. So there are a lot of, variables on that.
Definitely. That is also something I will say that I also sometimes rely on somebody who's got a little bit more authority than me to say no. So a project manager or a manager. I've worked in retail, so I've had to sometimes ask my manager to come and tell a customer no.
Yeah, that can be difficult, I imagine.
Yep. So just kind of to recap, what were some of the top takeaways that you want people to kind of go home with?
Yeah, so I think in terms of communication, a direct channel would be ideal, and also if you get the time as a customer, please allocate that time, because it will be useful from everyone's side. If you can like monitor what's going on in the channel, if the pentest project is doing some is having more transparency or more public information, that maybe you should totally follow up on that, because those are basically the skeleton of the pentest and what's going on. And as a closing point, I would say that, for example, not all the communication is based on the kickoff call or during the pen test. I think it's also important that we should not overlook the retesting phase, because that's also an important aspect. Or maybe after the project, like most of the customers like to retest or like to fix bugs just after the pen test has been done, which is usually the ideal workflow. Just so you don't alter the environment, the testing environment. And having that communication during that phase, like maybe the customer is not able to reproduce some findings, or maybe it's partially fixed, or the patch has been applied and they need some guidance on how to retest them on their own. That also falls in the communication category, and I think it's also an important aspect, to just keep in touch with the client and answer those questions.
Cool. I did also want to point out two other takeaways that I got from some of the things you were saying. One was just the communication begins before the test even starts and before the kickoff call. Like you're kind of spending some time, preparing, looking at the materials, connecting with your colleagues and getting everybody on the same page. And that's really cool. And the other thing that I really liked and wanted to call out was the notion of understanding and being a little empathetic, and just realizing that like not everybody's got the same schedule, not everybody's got the same background, just kind of understanding that everybody's coming from a slightly different place, I think are two very good points that you made. Cool. Was there anything else you wanted to add in before we call it a podcast?
I think that would be all from my side. I think the social aspect of a pen test is definitely important. Of course, the technical part gets you the juice. But the communication is also pretty important, and combining them together, I think it's the way to go. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Awesome. Thank you so much for stopping in and chatting with us, and thank you everyone else for tuning in for this episode of Pentester Diaries. I'm Grahame Turner. This is Stefan Nicula, and hope you enjoyed this conversation.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Hi there. Thanks for listening to Pentester Diaries, a podcast brought to you by Cobalt.io. We hope you enjoyed and welcome you to subscribe, share, or leave a review wherever you tune in from. You can catch more episodes by following Cobalt on LinkedIn and Twitter. Stay tuned for more episodes.